Can you talk a bit about the job that you'd done previously?
My wife and I both work in Papua New Guinea with international NGOs in community development. We've lived and worked there most of our life. I work mostly in remote areas, supporting community organisations that might be church groups, youth groups, women's groups, clan groups, family businesses, working with PNG organisations to help them find ways to build capacity of those sorts of groups. So I prepare a lot of training materials that don't require much ability to read and write, because in those situations most people can't. So I guess what I spend a lot of time on is helping to think creatively about how you can educate, or Papua New Guineans can educate their fellow Papua New Guineans to understand what are fairly sophisticated abstract concepts like transparency, accountability, theory, money management, what is money, all these things that we take for granted and sometimes we need to be reminded of in our culture. They're not obvious in other cultures, and it's difficult, perhaps impossible, to educate people about them. Largely they've just got to experience the advantages that it can give, because Papua New Guinea is moving away from traditional governance, which is clan-based, where you make decisions within a clan, which works fine, to now having to get on with other clans and government and businesses and people who aren't like them. And that's where you've got lots of difficulties in development in Papua New Guinea, because the ways to do that aren't well understood. For example, being transparent when you do anything, being accountable for what you say you're going to do, making decisions in a participatory way, not just one person saying do this, do that, for example.
So that's in the sort of the government and organisation side of things, or is that sort of within families?
It's both within families and within organisations, because effectively they're the same thing. But the main focus is on community organisations, so it might be women's groups, youth groups, etc., or clans. But family is the best place for people to try out new ideas. So for example, I mentioned transparency or participation. Within a family, try making a decision with your wife as well about how you're going to use money. And did it help? And if people decide, yes, actually it was good that we'd sat down together and decided how we're going to use our money, there was more harmony, we worked together, I didn't forget something that my wife knows about. You know, that if people decide that actually that did help our livelihood, then that can lead to change. You can't tell people about it, they've just got to experience it. So we often find in a community setting that the best approach is to work with families and to get them to consider these other ways of doing things. Women and men making decisions together, for example. Planning, for example, yeah.
My first question is, how did you get into it?
My wife was born in Papua New Guinea, although she's an Australian. She grew up in Deloraine. We went up, when I finished university, I was a teacher, trained as a teacher, we went up to Papua New Guinea as volunteers, with Australian volunteers abroad. Spent 2 years in a very remote location, 3 days walk from a roadhead. And we just decided that we loved it. So we continued to work in different ways, sort of NGO type work, AusAid type work. We work for universities, we work for the PNG government. Yeah.
So do they advertise? How does it work? How do you get connected with all of these organisations?
They do advertise for jobs, but generally we've worked with the same organisations. So I guess initially we applied for and got positions, and then once you're a known quantity, many organisations can just keep using you. Sometimes we apply and it's a competitive process, but mostly that people know us and we get jobs through networks. So for example, at the moment I'm working with honeybee farmers in Goroka in Eastern Highlands Province. So honey is a promising commodity in PNG because they don't have many of the mites and viruses that we didn't have, but most of the world has. And it complements a lot of the subsistence agriculture that people have. So there's potential there for income generation, and having money helps you through disasters and droughts and problems. So money is a good thing. You can't just rely on the food you grow. But there's also potential for business, for PNG market, but potentially also exporting honey. But the people who grow honey are smallholders, families, because virtually 97% of the land in PNG is traditionally owned. So people live on their land, and you don't get big farms. Most farms are small, and honey is something that small farms can grow. But to do that, you need some basic understanding of money and budgeting and finance and business principles, financial literacy, and that's lacking. So what I'm doing is working with PNG organisations to come up with training approaches to help people understand the principles of financial literacy. You can't do it with numbers, so you do it with metaphors and parables. So we use a fruit tree. So money should flow through a family in the same way that nutrients flow through a fruit tree. You need, if possible, lots of different roots, lots of sources of income. Deep roots are good. The first use of the money each year should be for the branches, not the fruit. Fruit is what you want, the branches are what you need. So your branches are your recurring costs, your maintenance costs, things you have to do. And then once you've met those costs, you can look at the fruit, which is what you want to do as a business or as a family. You do that through discussing it with your wife and your kids. And you have to remember to put nutrients back into the soil for next year. That simple cycle, and that's obviously savings, and the more savings you make, the more your roots grow. So gradually over time, as a fruit tree grows bigger, it can carry more fruit. It's the same with the business, or same with the family. And people get that, and they can visualise how that works, even if they can't understand numbers. So we use a lot of approaches like that.
How do you balance, obviously, working in PNG and living not in PNG?
It's a very good question. Well, it's been good, it's worked well. My wife does the same sort of work. We have 2 children. We can balance who's taking the lead in work. We don't work full time, we work casually. So we don't travel so much anymore. A lot of the work we do, because we've lived and worked there most of our lives and have lots of contacts there and know people there, we can do a lot of it remotely. So at the moment I'm revising training for community development workers against the PNG government's national standard for community development workers, pngcdwstandard.com if you want to have a look at that. And I can do that from here. That works well. Another question would be, how does it work juggling the table tennis club and working overseas? And that's difficult because since COVID, the work's only just starting to ramp up again. So my ability to be here to run the club I have to balance that with other responsibilities. So that'll be tricky, but I think it's going to be okay.
Thank you, Chris.
My pleasure.